They said you don't need to come to the wedding, just send a gift. That was it. No soft lead-in, no apology in their voice, just those exact words. My niece Clara's voice over the phone, quick and businesslike, as if she was checking something off a list. She didn't linger long enough for my reaction. She just paused, for a second, then launched into details about their honeymoon in Santorini, like she was reading from a travel brochure. I remember holding the receiver away from my ear for a moment, my thumb hovering near the end call button. It was absurd, the way those words seemed to echo louder than the rest, wrapping around my chest like cold wire. You don't need to come. I kept hearing them over and over, like my brain was poking at a sore tooth. It wasn't just that I wasn't invited, not really. It was that I was being told to send a gift instead. As if my presence could be substituted with a package wrapped in ribbon. As if the years I'd spent showing up, for birthdays, graduations, quiet nights when she called me crying, could be replaced by a delivery slip. I muttered something polite, of course, Clara, I understand, and the call ended with that strange cheeriness people use when they don't want to leave space for feelings. My hand was trembling a little as I set the phone down. Not dramatically, just enough that I had to rest it on the table for a second. The house felt louder after that. Every creak of the old floorboards, every distant car on the street outside seemed sharper, as though silence itself was holding its breath. I went to the kitchen, out of habit, and filled the kettle. Tea was my default, the way some people pour whiskey when they need to settle. I don't drink anymore, so I pour water over leaves. As the kettle hissed and clicked, I stared at the row of photographs on the counter ledge. Clara at 6 years old, missing front tooth and sticky hands from a melting popsicle. Clara at 15, hair piled high for her school dance, asking me if the earrings she'd picked made her look too much like a teacher. Clara at 22, sitting on my couch with a blanket around her shoulders, telling me through uneven breaths that her first real relationship had ended, and she didn't know how to breathe without him. All those moments, and yet now. I wasn't needed. The kettle whistled, sharp and impatient. I poured the water into my mug and watched the steam curl upward. My hands wrapped around the ceramic, absorbing its warmth, but inside I felt the opposite, as though something in me had been shifted into cold storage. It wasn't pride, not exactly. It was something heavier. A quiet recognition that somewhere along the way, I'd been moved out of the inner circle of her life without realizing it. People don't announce when they're making that decision. It happens in small, almost invisible cuts, unanswered texts, last-minute cancellations, being left out of group photos. By the time you notice, you're already on the outside. I carried the mug into the living room, sat in my usual armchair, and pulled the knitted throw over my knees. The fabric had little worn patches, places where the yarn had gone thin from years of use. I traced one with my thumb, wondering when exactly my place in Clara's life had worn thin in the same way. It's funny, we all tell ourselves that family is permanent, that there's a kind of glue holding it together no matter what. But glue dries, and if you leave it in the sun long enough, it cracks. I tried to remember the last time Clara and I had spent more than an hour together without other people around. It must have been 3 years ago? Maybe longer. She had stopped by one Sunday afternoon with a half-empty bag of laundry detergent and asked if she could use my machine. We drank tea in the kitchen while the spin cycle rattled the pipes, and she told me she was seeing someone special. That must have been Daniel, the man she was marrying now. At the time, her eyes had been bright, her voice quick with excitement. I'd smiled, asked questions, laughed at her stories. I'd made a mental note to invite him for dinner so I could see for myself the man who made her speak like that. But the dinner never happened. She'd been busy, then out of town, then nothing. I sipped my tea, now cooling on the table beside me, and felt a hollow place in my chest where anger should have been. It wasn't that I didn't care. It was that I cared too much, and I knew that showing anger would only push her further away. Still, the words kept looping back. Just send a gift. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, the light still pale and hesitant through the curtains. My dreams had been restless, flickers of Clara's face, wedding veils, and the sound of voices I couldn't quite place. I made coffee instead of tea, as though the sharper bitterness might wake something in me. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, intending to look for a gift. Something tasteful, not too personal. The kind of thing you send when you're not there in person. A decanter, maybe. Or a framed map of the city where they'd honeymoon. But the longer I scrolled, the more it felt like I was rehearsing my own absence. I closed the laptop. The quiet of the room pressed in again. That was when the thought first came, not fully formed, just a shadow of an idea. That maybe I could go anyway. It was ridiculous, of course. She'd made it clear. Showing up uninvited to a wedding would be, well, it would be something people talked about for years. But there was a small, stubborn ember in me that didn't care about the rules of decorum. I got up, walked to the hallway mirror, and studied my face. Not to check how I'd look for the wedding, that wasn't the point. I was looking for signs of someone who could do such a thing. Someone who could walk into a room knowing half the people there might think less of her. The woman in the mirror had fine lines around her mouth from years of smiling and frowning in equal measure. Her hair was streaked with silver, not in a trendy way, but in the way of someone who hadn't been to a salon in months. She looked tired, yes, but she also looked like someone who had weathered worse storms. I thought about the times I'd shown up for Clara without being asked. The night her father, my brother, had walked out on her and her mother, I'd driven across town in the rain, carrying nothing but a thermos of hot cocoa and a stubborn determination to make her laugh. The afternoon she got her first job and called me from the curb, too nervous to walk in alone. I'd left work early to stand by her side. Maybe this was no different. Maybe she didn't know she needed me there. I went back to the living room, pulled a notebook from the shelf, and began making a list. Not of wedding gifts, but of what I'd need if I decided to go. Dress, shoes, train ticket. Nerve. I didn't commit to it, not yet. I just let the idea sit there, warm and steady, while I went about my day. I watered the plants, paid the electricity bill, called my friend Marianne to ask how her hip surgery had gone. But under all of it, that ember kept glowing. By evening, when the light outside had deepened to that bruised blue just before nightfall, I found myself in the back of my wardrobe, sliding hangers along the rail. I touched fabrics I hadn't worn in years, silk blouses from old work conferences, a velvet skirt from a Christmas party long ago. And then my hand landed on it, a dress the color of late summer hydrangeas, soft but structured, with a neckline that made me feel taller when I wore it. I pulled it out and held it against myself in the mirror. It still fit. I hung it on the outside of the wardrobe door, not as a decision, but as a possibility. And that night, for the first time since Clara's call, I slept without dreaming. The dress hung on the wardrobe door for 2 days, a quiet sentinel. Every time I walked into the bedroom, it caught my eye, not demanding attention, just waiting. On the third morning, I reached out and brushed the fabric with my fingertips. It had a faint scent of cedar from years in storage. I thought of all the times I'd worn it, all the events where I'd smiled politely, shaken hands, and tried to fit in. That dress had been a kind of armor then. Maybe it could be again. I still hadn't told anyone. Not Marianne, not my sister Helen, certainly not Clara. Speaking it aloud would have made it too real, too soon. For now, it was mine alone, this strange seed of defiance growing quietly under my ribs. The official invitation hadn't come to me, of course it hadn't, but I knew enough. Clara's mother, my sister-in-law Lydia, had posted pictures of the save the date on her social media months ago. I'd memorized the location without meaning to. A converted barn by the coast. I'd been there once, years ago, for a different wedding, the kind where everyone still believed they'd stay in each other's lives forever. I opened my laptop, this time not for gifts, but to check the train schedules. The trip was longer than I'd remembered, 2 changes along the way. There was a small hotel in the village, expensive for its size, but they had 1 room left for that weekend. I booked it without letting myself think too hard. My hand didn't even tremble this time. The days that followed were quiet, but my mind was loud. I kept picturing it, the moment I'd walk in. Would she look surprised? Embarrassed? Angry? Would she take me aside, whisper that I shouldn't have come? Or would she simply smile tightly and move on? I wasn't naive enough to expect some grand reconciliation in the middle of the dance floor. I didn't imagine her dropping her bouquet to run into my arms. This wasn't about making a scene. It was about showing her, and maybe myself, that I hadn't stepped out of her life willingly. That some doors, once closed, could still be knocked on. One evening, a week before the wedding, I took the dress to the cleaners. The woman behind the counter, short and brisk with a pencil behind her ear, held it up and said, "Special occasion?" I almost laughed. Something like that. She nodded without pressing, which I appreciated. People don't always realize how intrusive their questions can be, even when they mean well. When I left the shop, the air had that sharp edge of early autumn, even though the calendar still swore it was summer. I wrapped my cardigan tighter and thought about the seasons, how they never arrive all at once. Change creeps in slowly, in the cooler mornings and the way the light slants differently through the windows. That night, I went through my shoes, pulling out the ones that didn't pinch or wobble. I settled on a pair of low heels in a soft beige, the kind that could survive both gravel paths and dance floors. I polished them until they looked almost new. The next morning, I called the hotel to confirm my booking, and the woman on the phone, cheerful in that trained, professional way, assured me everything was in order. I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, letting it sink in. I was really going. Still, a part of me worried about the reception I'd get, not from Clara, but from the rest of the family. Weddings are their own small ecosystems, full of unspoken alliances and grudges. I could already imagine Lydia's expression if she saw me. She perfected the kind of smile that looked warm to outsiders but felt like frost to anyone who knew her. I decided I wouldn't let their reactions dictate my own behavior. I would be polite, gracious, and impossible to ignore, not because I wanted attention, but because I wanted presence. There's a difference. 2 days before the trip, I went to the florist. I knew I'd need something in my hands when I arrived, something that would speak louder than any apology or explanation. Gifts can be ordered online and forgotten. Flowers, though, they are deliberate, fleeting, impossible to ignore. The shop smelled of damp earth and eucalyptus. The young man behind the counter, early 20s, hair falling into his eyes, asked if I needed help. I told him I wanted something unusual, something that wasn't just pretty but said something. "What do you want it to say?" he asked. I thought for a moment. That I care. That I'm here. That I'm not going anywhere. He tilted his head, considering. We could do proteas. They're hearty, long-lasting. Symbolize resilience. Mix them with white lisianthus, that's for appreciation, and maybe some olive branches for peace? It was perfect. I ordered a hand-tied bouquet, asked him to have it ready for the morning of the wedding so it would be fresh. That night, I ironed a shawl I hadn't worn in years, deep teal, soft enough to drape but warm enough for a coastal evening. I laid it carefully over the back of a chair. The dress, the shoes, the shawl. Everything in place, like puzzle pieces waiting for the final picture. On the morning of my departure, I woke before the alarm. The light was thin and silver through the curtains. I made tea, not coffee this time, and drank it slowly, letting each sip steady me. I packed my small suitcase, double-checking the essentials. There's a quiet satisfaction in knowing you've remembered everything, even if your heart is still uneasy. At the station, I found my seat by the window and watched the city blur into countryside. Fields rolled past, dotted with sheep and the occasional burst of wildflowers. The rhythm of the train was soothing, like a steady heartbeat. I thought about Clara as a child, how she'd always been impatient to get where she was going. On car trips, she'd lean forward from the back seat, asking every few minutes if we were almost there. I wondered if, in some way, I was doing the same now, leaning forward in time, eager and afraid to see what waited at the end of this journey. When we pulled into the small coastal station, the air was cooler, scented faintly with salt. I checked into the hotel, a quaint place with mismatched furniture and a cat that seemed to own the lobby. The receptionist handed me an actual brass key, which felt oddly comforting after years of plastic cards. I put my bag in the room and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the muffled sound of gulls outside. Tomorrow was the wedding. The thought landed in my chest like a stone dropped into water, heavy at first, then rippling outward. That evening, I walked down to the shore. The tide was low, revealing slick ribbons of seaweed and pools where tiny fish darted. I stood there for a long time, letting the wind push against me, until the sky turned a bruised purple and the first stars appeared. Back at the hotel, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I thought about what tomorrow might bring. It could be awkward. It could be cold. But it could also be something else, a crack in the wall that had been between us for years. I realized then that the point wasn't whether she embraced me or kept her distance. The point was that I would know I'd tried. That I'd stepped forward instead of stepping back. I closed my eyes, and this time, I slept deeply. The morning of the wedding began with the sound of gulls. Sharp, high calls outside the hotel window pulled me from sleep, and for a moment, I had to remember where I was. The room was washed in that pale, sea-filtered light that seems to belong only to coastal towns. I sat up slowly, the cool air against my arms. Today. The florist was just on the main street, so after a quick breakfast I walked there, coat collar turned up against the breeze. The bouquet was ready when I arrived, proteas standing proud, the lisianthus softening their edges, the olive branches framing everything with muted green. The young man wrapped it in simple brown paper, tied with twine. Perfect, I said, and I meant it. Holding it felt like holding a piece of my intention, quiet but firm, something living that couldn't be ignored. Back at the hotel, I set the bouquet gently in a vase while I dressed. The hydrangea blue dress slid uneasily, the fabric cool against my skin. I tied my hair in a low twist, letting a few strands fall loose, and draped the teal shawl over my shoulders. The shoes felt steady beneath me, no wobble, no pinch. I checked myself in the mirror one last time. Not glamorous, not understated, simply me, the best version I could manage without pretending to be someone else. The barn was a short taxi ride away. As we pulled up, I could see the guests gathering on the lawn outside, their laughter and chatter carrying on the wind. The building's wooden beams glowed warm in the sunlight, and the white bunting fluttered gently overhead. My heart gave one hard thump. This was it. I stepped out, bouquet in hand, the gravel crunching under my shoes. A few guests glanced my way, some with polite smiles, others with that flicker of recognition followed by something unreadable. Weddings are small towns for a day, everyone knows, or thinks they know, everyone else's place in the story. I spotted Lydia near the entrance, speaking to a couple I didn't recognize. She turned her head, and our eyes met. For a fraction of a second, her face was unreadable, then the practiced social smile appeared. "Margaret," she said as I approached, voice light. "What a surprise." I smiled back, matching her tone. "I wouldn't miss it." Her eyes flicked to the bouquet, then back to my face. "Well, I'm sure Clara will be touched." The pause before touched was just long enough to sting. Inside, the barn smelled faintly of flowers and wood polish. Rows of chairs faced an arch draped in white fabric and greenery. Guests were still finding their seats, murmuring in clusters. I found a place near the back, setting the bouquet on the empty chair beside me. The hum of conversation felt distant, as though I were underwater. My gaze kept drifting to the front, where Daniel stood with his groomsmen, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked calm, confident. Then the music began, soft piano, the kind that makes people instinctively straighten in their seats. Heads turned toward the entrance, and there she was. Clara. Her dress was simple, elegant, the skirt moving like water with each step. She held a bouquet of pale roses, her eyes fixed ahead. She didn't see me at first. It wasn't until she was halfway down the aisle that her gaze swept the room and landed on mine. For just a heartbeat, her expression faltered. Not shock, not joy, something more complex, a flicker I couldn't name. Then it was gone, replaced by the serene smile of a bride walking toward her future. The ceremony was beautiful, in the way all well-planned weddings are. Vows, rings, applause. But my mind kept circling back to that moment when her eyes had met mine. Afterward, the guests flowed outside for photographs. I lingered near the edge of the crowd, bouquet in hand, letting the sun warm my shoulders. Margaret? I turned to see her, Clara, standing just a few feet away. Up close, I could see the faint flush in her cheeks, the small crease between her brows. I didn't think, she began, then stopped. You're here. I am, I said. And I brought these for you. I held out the bouquet. She took it slowly, her fingers brushing mine. They're beautiful, she said, glancing down at them. Different. So are you, I said softly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Around us, cameras clicked, children laughed, glasses clinked. The world went on, but in that small space between us, something shifted, not fully, not finally, but enough. I should, she said, glancing toward the photographer calling her name. Go, I said. It's your day. She hesitated, then gave a small nod and moved away, the bouquet still in her hands. I stood there, watching her join Daniel and the rest of the bridal party, the proteas bright against the pale roses in her arms. I didn't know what the gesture meant to her yet, whether it would be remembered or forgotten. But for now, it was enough that it had happened. The reception began in the barn's adjoining hall, a wide space strung with soft lights and filled with the low hum of voices. Tables were dressed in white linen, each one crowned with a centerpiece of pale blooms and trailing greenery. The air smelled faintly of roasted chicken and rosemary. I slipped inside with the rest of the guests, keeping to the edges as people claimed seats. I hadn't been assigned one, no little card with my name waiting, but I'd expected that. I found an empty chair at a table near the back, beside a couple who were already deep in conversation about the wine list. They nodded politely as I sat, then went back to their talk. It suited me fine. I wasn't here to dominate anyone's evening. From my spot, I could see Clara and Daniel making their way from table to table, smiling, shaking hands, leaning in to hug relatives. When they reached Lydia's table, I watched as Lydia bent to whisper something in Clara's ear. Clara glanced briefly toward me, just a flicker, before nodding and moving on. I wondered what had been said, but I didn't dwell on it. Some things you don't need to know to understand. The music was gentle at first, the kind meant to fade into the background of polite conversation. I let the sounds and movements of the room wash over me. The clink of silverware. The occasional burst of laughter from the front tables. A child's high-pitched giggle from somewhere near the dessert display. The couple beside me were replaced after a while by two younger women, bridesmaids by the look of their matching satin wraps. One of them asked if I was with the groom's side or the bride's. I smiled and said, bride's, letting it rest at that. They nodded, satisfied with the simplest answer. Dinner was served in courses, a clear broth, then a rich main, followed by a small tart dusted with powdered sugar. I ate slowly, not out of shyness but because there was no rush. I wanted to take in the night as it unfolded. Every so often, I caught sight of Clara. She moved gracefully, her smile steady but not forced. When our eyes met across the room, she didn't look away quickly. It wasn't quite an invitation, but it wasn't avoidance either. Midway through the evening, as the plates were cleared, the best man stood to give his speech. It was light-hearted, full of gentle teasing about Daniel's habits and quirks. People laughed in all the right places. Then came the maid of honor, whose voice wavered as she spoke about Clara's loyalty and kindness. I listened closely, wondering how much of what she described was still true between us. After the toasts, people began to move again. Some drifted toward the dance floor, others toward the bar. I stayed at my table until the music changed, a slow, familiar tune from years ago, the kind you sway to without thinking. That was when Marianne's son, Peter, tall now, with the awkwardness of his teenage years smoothed away, appeared at my elbow. "Aunt Margaret," he said, grinning. "You're here. I didn't know you'd be here." I smiled at his surprise. Neither did most people, I think. He offered me his hand. "Dance?" It was unexpected, but I took it. On the dance floor, we moved easily, talking in low voices. He told me about his new job, his apartment, the dog he'd adopted from a shelter. I listened, laughed where it was right to, and let the music carry us. It felt good, that brief sense of belonging. When the song ended, he kissed my cheek and thanked me. I returned to my table, feeling lighter. Later, as coffee was served, I noticed Clara slip away from the crowd. She stepped outside through a side door, her dress catching in the soft evening breeze. I hesitated only a moment before following. The air was cool, carrying the faint tang of the sea. Clara stood near the railing, looking out toward the darkened fields beyond. When she heard my steps, she turned. "You look beautiful," I said. Her lips curved, though not quite into a smile. "Thank you. You do too." We stood there in the quiet, the muffled thump of music seeping through the walls behind us. "I wasn't sure you'd talk to me," I admitted. "I wasn't sure what I'd say," she replied. She glanced at the bouquet, still resting inside on a table near the cake. "Those flowers, they're not like anything else here. They stand out." "Maybe that's the point," I said. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, and I thought about all the things I could say, how hurt I'd been, how much I'd wanted to be part of her day, how I'd felt pushed aside for years. But none of it would come out right here, in the half-dark, with the night still unfolding. "Instead," I said, "I'm glad I came." She nodded slowly, eyes glistening in the light from the open doorway. "Me too." It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't an apology. But it was something, a step, small but solid, in the space between us. We went back inside together, and though we didn't stay side by side, I felt the distance had shifted, even if just a little. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of music, clinking glasses, and laughter that wasn't mine but didn't sting to hear. I spoke briefly to an old friend of the family, accepted a slice of cake, and watched as Clara and Daniel danced their first dance as husband and wife. When it was time to leave, I slipped out quietly, my shawl wrapped tight against the chill. The night air felt different now, not warmer, but less sharp. Back at the hotel, I set the bouquet in a glass of water by the window. The proteas were still strong, their petals unyielding, and I thought about how they'd last for days yet. Like the memory of this night, imperfect, complicated, but alive. The train ride home was quieter than the one there. Not because there were fewer passengers, the carriage was nearly full, but because I carried the kind of silence that follows an important moment. The bouquet, wrapped again in its brown paper, rested on the seat beside me. I had thought about leaving it in the hotel, but somehow it felt wrong. I kept replaying flashes of the previous day, Clara's eyes meeting mine as she walked down the aisle, her fingers brushing mine when she took the flowers, that small, careful me too when I said I was glad I came. None of it was dramatic. No music swelled, no tears fell in cinematic streams. But it was real, and real things don't always come dressed like stories. Outside the window, the fields slid by, golden green under a thin autumn light. I let the rhythm of the train steady my thoughts. I didn't feel victorious, exactly. I hadn't proved them wrong or changed the narrative in some grand, sweeping way. What I felt was quieter, but deeper. I had taken up space where I'd been told not to. I had shown up for myself as much as for her. When I reached my station, the city felt sharper, noisier, after the coastal air. I walked the few blocks home, the bouquet cradled in my arm. Unlocking the door, I stepped into the familiar scent of my house, a faint mix of old books, clean laundry, and the lavender oil I dabbed on the radiator covers in winter. I set the flowers in a tall vase on the kitchen table. Against the muted tones of the room, they looked almost defiant, their petals opening a little more now, as if they too had decided to take up space. That first night back, I didn't rush to tell anyone about the wedding. Marianne called, of course, she'd heard from her son Peter that I'd been there, but I kept my account simple. It was a nice day, I said. The bride looked beautiful. I didn't mention the look in Clara's eyes, or the way the air had felt between us outside the barn. Some moments are too fragile to pass around like coins. Over the next few days, life resumed its ordinary rhythm. Laundry, grocery shopping, paying bills. Yet everything felt slightly different, like a room that's been subtly rearranged. You can't always name what's changed, but you notice it when you move through the space. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the tortillas still standing tall beside me. I thought about the years I'd spent waiting for people to invite me in, not just to weddings, but into conversations, decisions, parts of their lives. It occurred to me that maybe I'd given others too much control over where I was allowed to be. I remembered a phrase my mother used to say when I was young: "Don't wait for the knock, open your own door." At the time, I thought it was about hospitality, about setting extra places at the table. Now I wondered if it was about something else entirely. The following week, I found myself looking at train schedules again. Not for another wedding, but for a trip to see an old friend I hadn't visited in years because I'd been waiting for the right time. I booked it without overthinking. That small, stubborn ember inside me had grown since the wedding, and I didn't want it to fade back to ash. Still, Clara was never far from my mind. I didn't expect a call or a message, and for a while, none came. But about 10 days after the wedding, a small envelope arrived in the post. My name, written in her handwriting. Inside was a simple thank you card. On the front, a watercolor of wildflowers. Inside, just a few lines. Dear Margaret, thank you for coming. It meant more than I can say to see you there. The flowers are still in my kitchen. They make me think of you. Love. Clara. I read it twice, then a third time. It wasn't an apology for not inviting me, it didn't need to be. It was acknowledgement. Recognition. A thread thrown across the space between us. I placed the card on the mantel, beside a photo of her at 16, leaning against the fence in my back garden, holding a mug of tea and smiling at something just out of frame. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the pinch of loss when I looked at it. As the days passed, I began to realize that showing up to the wedding had been less about getting back into her life and more about stepping back into my own. I'd let myself become someone who waited on the edges, watching life happen from a safe distance. And while that can feel comfortable, it also keeps you from the moments that might surprise you, even the complicated ones. One evening, I walked to the park just before sunset. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. I sat on a bench and watched as the sky shifted from gold to pink to a deepening blue. Couples walked past, parents with strollers, teenagers sharing a packet of chips. I thought about all the different kinds of togetherness, and how sometimes, even when you're not entirely in, you can still be part of the picture. I didn't know what would happen next with Clara. Maybe nothing. Maybe, slowly, we'd find our way back to a place where we spoke easily, without the weight of unspoken things. But even if that didn't happen, I knew I could live with it now. Because the truth was, I hadn't gone to the wedding for her alone. I'd gone for the part of me that still wanted to choose presence over absence, connection over distance, even when it risked discomfort. And that part, I realized, was very much alive. 2 weeks after the wedding, I took the tortillas out of their vase. Their petals, once strong and defiant, had begun to curl at the edges. The lisianthus had faded entirely, their softness gone brittle, and the olive leaves had dulled to a muted gray-green. I stood at the kitchen sink, peeling away the brown stems, feeling no sadness in their passing. Flowers are meant to be temporary. Their value is in the days they are alive, not in how long they can be made to last. I wrapped the remains in newspaper and carried them outside to the compost bin. The air was cool, the faint scent of damp earth rising as I lifted the lid. I laid the flowers in gently, as though they could still feel the care. As I closed the bin, I thought about how endings aren't always losses, sometimes they are just the next stage in a cycle. Inside, the vase stood empty on the table. I washed it, dried it, and left it bare for now. There was something freeing about the clear space it created. Life moved forward, as it always does. I visited my friend in another city, spending 3 slow days talking over long meals and walking by the river. I started attending a local history lecture series at the library, something I'd always thought I'd get around to someday. I even signed up for a pottery class, not because I thought I'd be any good at it, but because it was new, and I was tired of waiting for an invitation to try things. One evening, just as the last light was fading, the phone rang. I recognized the number immediately, Clara's. I hadn't spoken to her since the thank you card. I answered on the second ring, keeping my voice steady. Aunt Margaret? Her tone was softer than I remembered. I was wondering if you might come over next weekend. Just for tea. Nothing formal. A pause opened in my chest, a deep, warm one. I'd like that, I said. And that was all. No explanations, no rewinding of what had happened. Just a small step forward, offered without conditions. The following Saturday, I walked the familiar route to her house, the streets still damp from a morning rain. I carried a small tin of shortbread, the kind she used to love when she was little. She opened the door before I knocked, smiling in a way that didn't feel rehearsed. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon. She led me to the kitchen, where 2 mugs of tea sat waiting on the table. For the first few minutes, we talked about ordinary things, the weather, her new work project, the neighbor's cat that had decided their garden was its territory. It wasn't deep, but it was easy. There was no sense of something fragile teetering between us. At one point, I noticed a small vase on her windowsill. Inside were a few sprigs of eucalyptus and a single protea, its petals opening wide. They last a long time, she said when she saw me looking. I couldn't throw them all out. I smiled, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. They're resilient. We didn't dissect the wedding or the months before it. I didn't ask her why she'd told me not to come, and she didn't offer an explanation. Maybe that would come one day, maybe not. What mattered was that we were here, at the same table, with tea between us. When I left, she walked me to the door. The air was cooler now, the clouds breaking to reveal a pale wash of late afternoon light. Thank you for coming, she said. I nodded. Don't wait too long to ask me next time. Her smile widened, and for a moment, she looked like the girl in all those photographs, the one who had always run toward me without hesitation. On the walk home, I felt lighter. Not because everything was fixed, but because I'd stopped thinking it had to be. Relationships aren't puzzles to be solved, they're gardens to be tended. Sometimes you pull the weeds, sometimes you wait for something to bloom again. That night, I sat by the window with a book I never got around to reading, letting the quiet settle around me. The house no longer felt quite as still as it had the day Clara called to tell me I wasn't needed at the wedding. I understood now that not needed and not wanted aren't always the same thing. The difference, I realized, is that one leaves room for return. I didn't know what the coming months would bring between us, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that uncertainty. I would keep showing up, not in ways that forced my presence, but in ways that made it clear I valued the connection. And I would keep showing up for myself, even more so. Before I went to bed, I moved the empty vase from the kitchen table to the windowsill, where the light would catch it in the mornings. It would wait there, ready for whatever I chose to fill it with next. And maybe that was the lesson, the quiet truth I'd been circling around all along: you can't control who opens their door to you, but you can choose to keep your own unlocked.